This is Mark McNeese, and you're listening to One Thing or Another, interviews and conversations. Welcome to the podcast. This is your host, Mark, here, and today my guest is historian and author A.J. Schenkman. A.J. is a New York-based writer. Since his start writing for local newspapers, A.J. has branched out into writing for magazines, blogs, and academic journals in both history and other subjects. He's the author of several books about local and regional history. You can find him on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and at his website, ajschenkman.com. And he has a new podcast, but I'll ask him about all of that later in the show, and he can give us the URLs where to find him and his podcast and his books. AJ, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. The sun's finally shining.
Yeah, we were talking before we started recording. I live in the woods in New Jersey, and where do you live?
I live right underneath the Schenkman Mountains in New Paltz in the Hudson Valley. And it's pretty windy up here, but it was raining for a few days, and it was cold, and now it's actually so beautiful out. Spring has kind of sprung, as my mother used to say.
Is there a train station near you that you could take from the, because I used to live in New York City. Obviously, I don't anymore, but Are you near a train station? I'm just curious.
Yes. The Poughkeepsie train station's not too far. We used to have the rail trail, the rails around here, but they're gone. They're now the rail trail. But, yeah, this would be the Poughkeepsie train station is probably the closest across the river.
So I sort of do know where you live because my brother-in-law and his wife and daughter used to live in Poughkeepsie. They moved to Virginia, but Frank and I used to go to Poughkeepsie with some regularity. So I have an idea where you are.
Yeah, it's it's such a nice, it's such a beautiful place. I think I love the Hudson Valley as much as Franklin Delano Roosevelt loved the Hudson Valley. It feels like home to me. But I used to live in another valley called the Queens Valley, right near Flushing, Kew Garden Hills, and just as historic as this place up here, but and founded by the Dutch as well.
Well, I want to hear about all of that and start out with a little bit of the 411 on you, who you are and where you are, and then we'll get into your interests in the local histories and becoming an author about them for the most part.
Okay. Well, I'm a town historian in Gardner, and I'm a former first responder as well, and I used to live in a small area known as Kerhonkson up by the Minnewaska State Park, and a lot of people downstate know where that is because it's known for its rock climbing and mohonk and all that great stuff. And I moved back over the mountain, but I've always been interested in the history of the Hudson Valley, going way back to when my aunt owned a home up here. And even when I lived in New York City, I worked on one of the only working farms left in New York City, the Little Neck Farm, which is a Dutch farmstead, and worked at state historic sites, and always had a passion for writing and storytelling, and just, I mean, I was going to be a lawyer early on, but just found I loved history too much, and I loved teaching and talking about history, so I became a teacher, and I teach 7th grade social studies, and most people kind of cringe when they hear, oh my God, you're teaching 7th graders, but I absolutely love it. I've taught high school, I've taught middle school and elementary, and I absolutely love the 7th grade, 8th grade groups.
How did you become the town historian for Gardner?
Well, when I moved over here, I always dreamed of becoming a town historian, and unfortunately, Carlton Mabee passed away, and very well-known author and professor, and they were looking for someone, and I put my name in at the office, and at that point, I'd already had some, town office, and I've already had some books that have been published, and I'd been known for writing for local newspapers, and they were really glad to have me. And it's been a lot of fun in helping people discover their roots and all the great things that have gone on in this valley.
I live near a town called small city called Lambertville, New Jersey. I think of it more as a town than a city, but I'm friends with the historian for Lambertville. So it's fascinating the things you can learn about a town, and they give house tours and garden tours. There's a lot of history here. Now, you're also an author, but and a teacher, obviously. Do you consider yourself primarily a majority of one thing or another, or is it all part of the same package?
I think it depends on the day. One thing I'm not is, as I always tell my students, I'm not an antiquarian. I don't just collect old things and collect dates. And, I think, if anything, I'm a historian and author. But lately, I think I've been coming down more on the side of a storyteller. I like to tell the stories of people that have lived and loved and and I just when my aunt had a home outside of New Paltz. The house dated back to the early 1800s, and I had researched it right down to the doorknobs, and I could see people's lives unfolding in that house. Where people lived and loved, and children that were born, and maybe some even died in the birthing room, which was my room, and and just one of the stories that sticks out in my mind is when I bought my house in Kerhonkson. I was the first non-Sherman to own that house, and then the owner's son came up to me. Day we were selling the house, and they were selling the house, and I'm looking around, and he said, "Do you mind if I have one last look around upstairs?" I said, "Sure, go ahead." And he was smoking a cigarette in the house, and I ran upstairs, telling him, really prefer you don't smoke in the house, and blah blah blah. Probably I should have let him, but and he was in this one room, and I went to say something to him, and he turned around, he had tears in his eyes, and I said, "Are you all right?" And he said, "I was born in this room." He said, "And my brother and sister were born in this room, and my father was born in this room." And he said, "It's real tough to leave it." And I said, "We could call off the sale." And he said, No. He said, "There's nothing here for me anymore." And then he walked me around the property, and I said, "Fred, are those teeth on that stump out there? That pole?" He goes, "Oh, yeah. He goes, "Those are my grandmother's teeth." I said, "What are your grandmother's teeth doing there?" He said, "We put in the first septic, which would have been a cesspool, and the first bathroom." And he goes, "The old pull string type." And he goes, "My grandmother didn't believe that it was going to work. She looked over to watch it flush, and her bottom teeth fell out." And he goes, "And we fished around for those teeth." He said, in that cesspool all day. And he said, "We finally found them." And he goes, "My father just dumped some bleach on them." And he said, "Here they are." And she says, "I'm not putting those in my mouth." and he says, "Well, I can't afford a new pair. They'll be out here bleaching in the sun." And there they've been for almost a century. It's like I tell my students, another good one, when I was a kid during the war in Bosnia, every time I remember watching a reporter, and a photographer was being interviewed, and he said, "That's a great picture of a cat running across the minefield." And he said you could see the fear in its eyes and every muscle, tense. And he said, "Where would I get a copy of that?" And he says, "You can't." And he goes, "What do you mean?" He goes, "That's the only copy." He said, "And when the war's over, I'm going to destroy it so that cat can rest. Because for as long as that picture's there, that cat will forever be running for all eternity." And that's kind of the way, when I put a picture up of, Albert Cashier, who we'll talk about later. For that moment, Albert's alive. And as I'm telling Albert's stories, he's always going to be alive. And you can still learn from Albert. And I think that's a real Native American perspective. It was a book called Joe Two Trees, and he tells this little boy his whole story, and he's at this point dying. And this kid says, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because as long as someone knows my story, I will always live." So I guess so. I'm sorry, but for the long-winded answer, but that's how history kind of speaks to me, and that's in a lot of ways how I teach, and I think that's why my students love my class.
Well, I want to ask you about how you research things. Let's start with the book. It's called Unexpected. This particular book, it's called Unexpected Bravery:
Mm-hmm.
Women and Children of the Civil War. It tells the stories through archival material and firsthand accounts of women and children who served in the Union Army during the Civil War. And I do think was it strictly the Union Army? I read quite a few of them, but not all of them. It was only the Union Army that that the book is about, not that fought. I'm sure there were women and children in the Confederate Army too.
There are some in the Confederacy. I did write predominantly about the Union. And I used pensions, which are in the, National Archives. And what's interesting about this Civil War, as opposed to the first Civil War, I always call the American Revolution America's first Civil War, is that people were very literate. Most people were literate. And I always liked Ken Burns', quote, where he said that these people were making history. They knew they were making history, and they knew they were part of something, great. And they kind of knew it. So they were, keeping diaries, writing letters home. They later on wrote books about it. There are regimental histories. There were pensions, and unlike the Revolutionary War, most of the pensions survived because Washington was burned in War of 1812. So a lot of the Revolutionary War records went with that. And also, I use newspapers, and there's, still a lot of, diaries and things that are in archives that have not been published. Like I think it's Charles Hadley kept his diary. And of course, there's also, gravestones that sometimes will tell a story as well. What I love to do is read the letters, because the letters weren't meant to be read by anybody except the receiver. And so a lot of times the soldiers are a little bit more forthcoming about fear and about things that are really going on. What they thought about fellow soldiers, what they, one guy refers to the Illinois 95th as the bold and bloodless 95th, because they haven't been in any battles yet.
Mm-hmm. What got you interested in the story of women and children in the service, in the military?
I think one's being a father, and and thinking about that. And years ago, I read a book about a child who was in the Bosnian conflict, and also just sometimes running down a rabbit hole on the Library of Congress, and a picture of a 14-year-old dead Confederate boy in one of the ditches there, and in one of the trenches. And just thinking, what's a 14-year-old boy doing in a war? And then, of course, once you hit that, you run down, more down to another rabbit hole, and, you see someone like Johnny Clem, and you're like, God, this guy kid was 9, 10, or Grant's son, who, writes about, seeing dead people and dismembered bodies, and just wondering, like, why were there children there? And then once you go that route, then you start finding that there were a lot of people that, that just how horrible this war was and what a toll it took on families. And then I've always been interested in people that, are outside, the social norms. So I started to find out that, there were women that dressed as men, and, and that there were African American women who were liberated from slavery and went right into the war to help their husbands, and just, it's just such a time of such rich history, and it's so well documented as well.
Well, speaking of it being documented, where did you go to? I mean, it can't all be online, obviously. Where did you go to research these? Some of the places that you went to research these things.
Everything from local archives. Though some of this was happening during the pandemic, I did hire a researcher from the National Archives, but some of the stuff from the National Archives are online. Old newspapers that are at the universities. I'm going to use an old word, was it microfished?
Yeah.
And also, believe it or not, so much of this is online, especially in newspapers. A lot of the newspapers have been digitized, but those local newspapers, like the New Paul's Independent, are not. And I was in a prior life the consulting historian for Huguenot Street, so I was able to get my hands on some of those papers, and so not everything I researched was used in the book, but somehow it influenced it. I mean, like Johannes Lefevre. Their heart-wrenching letters. Those are now online about, where his father, his son's been shot. He heads down there, down south to see his son, and on the way back, he gets a letter from the doctor saying he's taking a turn for the worse. I don't think you'll make it back here. And just to read those letters back and forth. It's just and it's just it's heart-wrenching. It's horrible.
Now, let's talk about Albert Cashier, who today we would call transgender. I'm sure they didn't have that concept back then. But tell us about Albert, because also when I was reading it, Albert obviously had been Albert, or had been living as a man, or for the most part, before he enlisted or before he got into the military. So can you talk about Albert?
Sure. His friends, especially in the Army, the Union Army in the 95th Illinois, Company G, if I remember correctly, they called him Al. And he was born Jenny Hodgers around 1843-44 in Ireland on the northern coast. And it's hard to research him because when people really started to take an interest in him, he was older and he was starting to he was a little senile. And also to keep people kind of at bay, there's a lot of contradiction in his story, and his stories that he told. And so we don't really know much about his early life. And it's possible that he was illegitimate, and he claimed that he had a twin who died at birth, and that his mom died too, and that his father's last name was Cashier. And early on, he goes to New York City with an uncle, and his uncle's name is Dennis Hodgers. And in Ireland, his uncle was a sheep dealer. And then when they got to New York City, Albert worked in a shoe factory with Dennis. And Albert was, in order to work, had to dress like a boy. That's what he was told. What he told some people that were, about his life story. But then he said that in another story that he said he remembered dressing up as a boy when he was herding sheep. And then he leaves New York City and he ends up going out to Illinois, where he becomes a farmer. And he says that he lives near Belvedere. And for a while he worked for a man named Sawyer, but then he later changes that and says that he worked for a man named Avery. And it's either Avery or Sawyer who brings him to enlist. But in 1914, he tells somebody that that the reason that, and this was in 1914, that the reason that he joined the Army was because his lover joined the Army as well. And unfortunately, his lover died, was wounded and died during the war, and his lover asked him never to wear women's clothing again. And the reason that he assumed, the garb, wearing men's garb, was so he could so he could join and be with this unknown person. But then he says again at some other point, he says, quote, "Lots of boys enlisted under wrong names. So did I. The country needed men, and I wanted excitement. I worked on an Illinois farm as a man the year before the war. I wasn't discovered, and I thought I'd try my luck in the service." And then if that's not, a reason to join all these things, his $60 sign-on bonus, which would probably be about $2,000 today. He signed on for that. And this is during a time where in 1869 in Ohio, a laborer could expect to make about $10 a week.
Well, it's interesting to me because you can't really tell what the truth of any of it was. It's easy for me to imagine that Albert was indeed transgender, as we would think of it today. And these were ways for him to explain it without having the concepts and language that we have today. I just get the feeling he was a trans man, and this is certainly possible that this was the case, and that these were ways that he could justify it or explain it to himself and to other people. I'm reading that into this, And
I agree with you with that 100%. And I think that he never really knew how someone was going to react to him. And as I've explained in talks and such, that and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think I have my history right with this, that right up until in England, up until the 1950s, being homosexual, being gay was against the law, and you could be locked up for it, as well as in the good old United States. And so you never knew what was going to happen. And when you're going into the records in the Civil War, there are women that are discovered as dressed as men, and they're thought of as insane. And sometimes they're flat out thrown in prison. So I think he had to be cautious, and he seemed to learn who he could trust. Because those people who are in his, I guess as Robert De Niro has said in that movie, those who were in his circle of trust, knew about everything. And what was amazing is that they were so non-judgmental. And maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but when he leaves the service and he goes for a pension, the pension's fine. On all his records, he's listed as a guy. And then when at one point he's listed as a female, and the federal government gets wind of it, and there's a whole investigation. That's how we know so much about Albert. And what happens is that the federal government really doesn't care that this might have been a woman. What they're concerned about is that someone's been embezzling, and they want to make sure the right person got the money. And in all the depositions, it reminds me of when the pioneers were going out west and they were trying to decide if we should give the women the right to vote. And the pioneers said, hey, my wife was right alongside me, breaking the plains, hunting buffalo, fighting off marauders, all of that stuff. She earned the right to vote. And that's what a lot of people felt as well, that we don't really care. He was brave. And he was a good guy, and he surely proved himself, and he deserves his pension. And so the next question is, how did he evade being found out? Not until the 1870s are there any kind of real physicals. They might just tap your hands, look in your eyes, and say you're good to go.
Mm-hmm.
So, but if he got wounded, that's when a lot of women that were dressed as men were found out when they were wounded. And the way it's found out initially about Albert is a senator, a local senator who Albert's working for, doesn't see that Albert's working behind the car, and he runs over him and he snaps his leg right at the hip, which gives me chills. And he was disabled. And when they had to call the doctor realized, but even then, everyone agrees to keep it hush-hush.
Mm-hmm.
Even when he's in the sailor and soldier's home and he's disabled, everyone's keeping it hush-hush. It's not until much later, the last year of his life, that somebody, goes against it, has him in a dress, in woman's ward, and listed as a female. But when he's buried as a soldier, as a man, and with full military honors.
And with, I think, both names on the tombstone.
Yes, which this is just my opinion, which I think is kind of a little disrespectful. But I've seen writings where they keep referring to Albert as her. And, it's hard to get into someone's head. Was it disrespectful? Was it genealogical? But I made a conscious decision to refer to Al as a him because that's what I believe he wanted to be referred to as. And everyone around him felt that way as well. And I think also the reason that people in his own circle didn't betray him is because they liked him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they valued him. And as I've said, to other people, as I've thought about this out loud to friends, that it's easy also to decree and to, I guess, and to look at somebody as other when you're not face to face with them. And I think that maybe they saw, hey, he's just like us, and who are we, to judge who he is or who he is to love. I mean, if you're like my mother said, if God created all of us and God made no mistakes, then Albert's not a mistake either. There's a reason everybody's here. And so...
Yeah, I certainly think of him as a he and a man. I just... as a trans man specifically, but I thought it was nice that they put the male name on the tombstone. I know they included both names, but it might seem disrespectful to put the female name on there, but it was also very respectful to bury him as Albert Cashier.
I agree. Okay, I agree with that, and also with full military honors. And I didn't know when I was researching this, didn't know where this was going to go. And I was blown away that his comrades, his colleagues, his soldiers, everybody looked out for him and everybody felt as though he was, he earned full military honors, and especially the federal government. You would think during that time period, the federal government would have just taken the pension away, but they increased it. And before everything was resolved, unfortunately, he passed away. The other thing that I feel as though Albert might have been suffering from, though aside from everything else, is how people were protective of him because he seemed to be suffering from what we would call PTSD.
Oh, okay, sure.
He was very fearful of people wanting to hurt him, rob him. And he had like 5 or 6 locks on his doors, and he would keep changing those locks every so often. He'd nail his windows shut. People, I think, were also concerned about that he could at times be a little bit mentally unhinged. But, if you saw what these people saw, I think that, I think that it would have been very difficult just to carry on.
Now, what's ahead for you? What are you working on now, or is there anything specific?
I'm still looking into African American drummers during the Civil War. I'm also interested in women in the Civil War, in the American Revolution, children. But I'm also very, 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 very interested in Eleanor Roosevelt. As I was saying to my students, it's talking about some of the things that she did in her life, with African Americans and Jews and the Japanese and civil rights, and they're like, kind of, yeah, okay, so. And I'm like, hey, this is in the 1930s, and just what the cutting edge that woman was on or in, and also because she's someone who changed her whole point of view. Some of the things that you read about her early on in her life, they were racist, they were anti-Semitic, and she came full circle and she changed. And it kind of gives me, hope, as Edward Kennedy once said, where there's hope, where there's life, there's hope, and, to see that maybe, society will come around, too, and be a little less divided.
Speaking of that, how do you divide your time? You're a father, you're a teacher, you're a historian, you're an author.
Well, I used to be a really busy guy. I was a volunteer firefighter for many years, and now what I do is I teach, spend a lot of time with my family, hike, and just do a lot of reading, and just constantly listening to my students, because some of my best ideas come from my students. And just do their questions. And by the way, I didn't even think about it, actually. Obviously can't use the student's name. But sometimes when we're talking about history, a student will ask me, were there trans people during this period of time? Were there gay people at this time? Were there, what were Jews doing? What were Catholics doing? And I try to have everybody included in my classroom, and most of all, children that are identifying, as trans or questioning their own sexuality, they deserve a place at the table as well. So sometimes when a student will ask a question, as long as it's appropriate for the age group and everything, I'll go and check it out. I'll research it. And it could be something as mundane as, how did Abraham Lincoln deal with most of his children dying, or having his wife, a Southern sympathizer, and we talk about these things, and names like Sally Hemings come up, and, did Jefferson know that did he know that slavery was wrong? And so, the kids today are very sophisticated. And social media is kind of bringing a lot to the forefront.
Well, you actually sound like a teacher that I would really like to have. I am far beyond the 7th grade, but you sound like the kind of teacher who would stoke my imagination and my curiosity. I will have to say that.
Because that's the teachers that I had. And I had teachers that I was a little different, and my teachers saw that. And I had one teacher, his name was, I don't know if he's around anymore, Mr. Bill Pfister. And he grew up in Amish country. And I just remember a couple of teachers, giving me a hard time about my writing. And he defended me. And he said, you just stay the way you are. He goes, and he's the first person, I think, that really, really believed in my writing and said, one day, you're gonna go far. And I tell my students that I was one of the worst writers in my class, and he made me believe in myself.
I really like that. I am Facebook friends with my high school creative writing teacher. He's got to be in his late 70s or his 80s at this point, and he also believed in my writing and told me that I was one of the few students he'd had that he thought could actually succeed as a writer. So I've always just really been, I've considered that to be very important in my life and my creative endeavors. Now, I just want to remind people the book that we talked about, it's called Unexpected Bravery, Women and Children of the Civil War. It's in paperback and Kindle. It's on Amazon. Where else is it?
Wherever books are sold. And, Barnes & Noble. And I do encourage you to go to your local bookstore. If you're listening from New Jersey, there's some great bookstores in Montclair and some old-fashioned Italian pork stores that are absolutely great. And, try to, give those people your business first before you go out to Barnes & Noble or Amazon or any of those big companies.
I try. There's a bookstore in Frenchtown that's relatively new, and I spent some money there recently, and I'm also doing a reading there, but this podcast is not about me. Let people know, because I write murder mysteries, but let people know your website and the podcast, which is the podcast where I wrote the name down again.
It's the History Knickerbocker.
Yes.
And I'm just having fun and, getting better each time. Bought a little equipment to make my voice sound better. My website is ajschenkman.com. You could also find me on Facebook as well. And, and I'm on Twitter and, I'm one of those people that like to interact with my fans as long as to sound like a teacher, as long as you're appropriate and, not writing silly things. Would love to hear from anybody.
By the way, the History Knickerbocker, how are you using Knickerbocker in that context?
That's in my trailer. How am I using that? Well, Knickerbocker refers to people that were of, Dutch heritage, the old timers like the FDR, like the Roosevelts, but also people that are from New York are also known as Knickerbockers, the New York Knickerbockers. So that's how I'm using it. It's New York State history. We've talked about Margaret Corbin, the real Molly Pitcher, Jonathan Hasbrook, Washington's headquarters in Newburgh, and all things New York State. And I'm always open to, to people suggesting things as well. I think I might be doing one on Big Bad Bill, the Gardner desperado, our own, like Butch Cassidy out this way, who's a very interesting individual, who's made appearances in some of my books. But I'm hoping at some point to do a memoir or to start getting into some kind of historical fiction. I just read a book, I guess this is kind of like a plug for them, huh? We're the Lucky Ones, about a Jewish family just on the eve of the Germans invading Poland. A book completely blew me away. I just wish that I wish I could write like that, and that's kind of my dream, to write historical fiction, maybe hit some memoirs as well about life, growing up and hardship and anxiety and all of that stuff. And if I can do all this, you can too.
That's a great message to end the conversation with. Thank you. Again, it's AJ.
All right.
It's AJ Schenkman. It's been really delightful talking to you. You're fascinating. I wish you had been my social studies teacher. I don't remember who was, and I'm sure that they were good. But some teachers, like just stand out. They just stand out, and they stay with you throughout your life. And
I remember mine. Mine was Sergeant Louis Brody, and he stormed the beaches in Normandy.
Oh, wow.
And I remember him telling us stories about that. It was great.
AJ, thank you so much for talking to me, and I will get this link to you within the next few days and share it with everybody I can.
Thank you so much, and have a really good day. Stay safe in this pandemic and all the craziness that's going on in the world.
Okay, you do the same.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye. You've been listening to One Thing or Another. Interviews and conversations with your host, Mark McNeese, brought to you by Maidmark Publishing. Find us on iTunes, Amazon, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to your favorite podcasts.